Welcome to the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast. Right now, we're going through the entire Bible to understand it as one big, cohesive story. We're covering one book each day, and this one's about Numbers.
Hey, my friends, it's Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast. The name of this book is Numbers, and I think the name is trash. And look, I understand that some of you are gasping right now. You can't say the name of a book of the Bible is dumb or bad, can't I? Because that part isn't actually inspired by God. Christians don't believe that. This could have been named something better. Look, I get why they called it Numbers, because there's a census at the beginning and there's a census at the end. And in this ancient Near Eastern Bronze Age context, the fact that the people descended from Abraham, Isaac, Jacob/Israel, and then his sons, we talked about Joseph and Judah, for example, the fact that these people grew up into this gigantic people group, well, just the numbers alone tell a story that God is keeping his promise, that Abraham would be taken from being just like some guy from the middle of nowhere, and that he would become this great nation with descendants as numerous as the stars. It's happening. And further, in that ancient Near Eastern context, numbers is a big deal. Like just having a lot of people, that is power. Having a lot of livestock, having a lot of descendants, a lot of firstborn sons, a branched out and diverse family that has chieftains and tribes within it, that comes with a lot of opportunity. But right now, this people group is homeless. However, if you recall that promise God made to Abraham, one of the four things that was in there is that there was a land that was promised, and that land is Canaan. So the plot of Numbers isn't really there was two censuses and look, there's a lot of descendants of Abraham now. The plot is going from Mount Sinai, where we end up at the end of Exodus and where the law is revealed, or the beginnings of the law, and where we are throughout the entire book of Leviticus while we figure out why Moses can't go into the tent, while we're figuring out what it takes to prepare oneself to be in the presence of the beauty and the power and the terror and the awe-inspiringness of the metaphorical tiger, that is, of a holy God. While we're figuring that out in Leviticus, we're also still at Mount Sinai. But then we get into Numbers and we find that the question of being able to enter into the presence of God for Moses has been resolved. We know enough of the ground rules now that it's time to move. And so the first 10 chapters of Numbers opens with a census to get a sense of how many fighting men we're going to have. But the reason we got to find out how many fighting men we're going to have is because we're not just going to look at a bunch of numbers. We're going to have a great big giant quest. We're going to have this journey through the desert. It should only take half a month. And all you got to do is just walk to Canaan, right up there to the south end of modern day Israel, and go in there and defeat a bunch of people who God already said he was going to defeat. I mean, he already beat Egypt. Are you kidding me? It's the most powerful empire on the planet at this point. He's going to have no trouble with these little local tribal kings and chieftains that are scattered around Canaan. You just got to go there and God's going to take care of everything. And so maybe on the front end of the book of Numbers, at least, a different name that you could give it would be like The Journey to the Conquest, or Moses' Grand Conquering March. Ooh, that sounded pretty good. But we'll discover as we go through the book of Numbers that you could still come up with a more dramatic name than Numbers. But it's not so conquery after all, because this thing goes south in a hurry. Again, the first 10 chapters, we're still at Mount Sinai. Everything's going really pretty well. It looks like we're past some of the ick and mix-up from the end of Exodus. The relationship with God is right. God gives a bunch of directions early on here in Numbers for how the camp is to be organized and what the deal is going to be with God leading Israel into conquest by his presence. And there's even symbolic significance in just the way the camp is designed. It all points to this is not a normal people group with a normal king, the one true God, maker of all things, who is in the early phases of his grand redemptive plan. He is the one who is at the center, and then when they are progressing, at the head of this entire people group and everything that they're setting out to accomplish. So we get the numbers, we get the plan for the camp, we get a sense of what the priests and the leaders need to do, even more so than we get in Leviticus, for how to lead and how to be pure and how to be the go-between between the people and God. And then they start traveling. And I'm not kidding you. Have you ever gone on a trip and you're like, all right, we should be fine. And within 15 minutes of being on the interstate, your kids, who you love, are immediately like, I have to poop. Why didn't you poop at home, Kyle? I didn't have to poop then. You couldn't have figured out I really have to stop now. Oh my goodness, he's touching me. He's touching me. Okay, nobody touch anybody. Oh my goodness, we're at mile marker 14. How on earth can we already be to this state? We have 2,500 miles to drive. I've never experienced anything like that, but maybe you have. That's the kind of stuff that we get here, except way worse. These complaints aren't just like, I'm not having fun. I'm not enjoying the food that God is miraculously providing from the heavens in the form of manna. Rather, these are the kind of complaints that are like, can we just go back to being slaves? We hate it that much. This plan is dumb. We don't like following God in this way. Egypt was fine. Let's just un-Exodus. Maybe he would part the sea again for us to go back. If we went the exact same way, we could even get some free chariot parts on the way by. And God isn't impressed. Even Miriam and Aaron, his own family members, start calling Moses out in front of everybody. The wheels are coming off. Well, the journey continues, though it is not a pleasant one by any stretch of the imagination, and they make their way right up to the southern end of what I guess you would call the promised land, to a place called the wilderness of Paran or Paran. And that takes us from chapter 13 up to the beginning of chapter 20. And here, Moses is like, all right, just all I have to do is just endure this a little bit longer. It's loud in this minivan, but we're going to get to where we're going. It's going to be fine. So he's a little bit beleaguered. He doesn't totally have everybody's support, but it's been an exhausting trip. So he sends a bunch of spies into the land. We get all of their names. And these 12 spies go in, and this land has already been promised to them. God's already done miraculous stuff, but they come back out, and in front of everybody, 10 of the spies are like, no, it's never going to happen. They got like giants in there. It's just, we're totally going to lose. It's not even that great, actually. I don't know. I wouldn't do that. Now, they have no constructive proposal for where to go with, a couple million people or whatever in an inhospitable desert, but they do not want to go in there. Well, 2 of the spies are like, actually, I think we got it. It's going to be great. We should go right now. God will surely deliver this into our hands. Let's go. Well, the crowd sides with the 10, and they turn on Moses in a way that is ugly. They try to mutiny and kill him and replace him. There's jealousy over the role of Aaron and his family in the priesthood. This family of a guy named Korah, they start throwing a fit about things, and then stuff gets real. You start getting plagues in the camp, and then eventually you get snakes in the camp, and these sons of Korah who are complaining about stuff, the earth opens up and just devours them like in some kind of cartoon you watched when you were a kid. You would think things like this would cause people to be like, we should stop complaining on our road trip and just go conquer the thing. Like, if God can eat people with the ground when they complain loudly enough, he can probably help us conquer these tiny little chieftains and tribal leaders in a land that he's promised to us. But nope, they complain a whole bunch. And in the end, despite Moses' intercession, God's like, no, I'm going to give the people what they want. They don't want to go into the land. They don't want to conquer it. Cool. I'm going to let all of that generation die. But through the conversation with Moses, it's agreed upon that the next generation, the complainers' kids, will get to go in. And this is just a heartbreaking turn of events, because it means, one, these people are never going to go in. But 2, it also means you're going to have to wander around in the desert on this miserable road trip in the metaphorical minivan with those metaphorically loud and smelly kids who are at each other's throats until everyone from that generation dies. So now we start our second travel segment, and this one is to nowhere, I guess. Like, just kind of driving around a roundabout again and again and again, and now the complaining is getting insane. And Moses, now there's no plan. Where the heck is this supposed to go now? Why am I even leading these people? What do we do? And he loses his cool. People are complaining about water. Moses is supposed to do a miracle to give them water. He doesn't do it the way God said. He does it out of anger and in a way that's in defiance of God. And the water comes out anyway. But that's enough for God to be like, even you, Moses, you don't get to go in the land. Not even you. And it's on these travels that I mentioned earlier that the snake thing happens. And yet even in the midst of these plagues and these punishments, God is still delivering them and still protecting them, including making this bronze snake that gets lifted up out in the wilderness. When people look at it, they get better from their snake bites. So we're back to the question of what do we call the book of Numbers? We're about 2/3 of the way through it. I don't know. Numbers is still boring to me, but the Grand March of Conquest, that doesn't work anymore. The nightmare minivan road trip from hell with everybody who just complains all the time, and now you have to drive around until everybody dies, and then only their kids can get to the ultimate destination. That's too wordy. It turns out the Jewish people saw this conundrum as well. They didn't call the book Numbers. They called it the Wanderings in the Wilderness. And I think that's a lot more reflective of the futility that you feel as you read through this book. And I think God's anger with the whole mess comes through in this very scary thing in Numbers 14 that he has Moses say to the people who are griping about everything. He says, "So tell them," now this is quote God, "as surely as I live, declares the Lord, I will do to you the very things I heard you say. In this desert your bodies will fall. Every one of you 20 years old and more who was counted in the census and who has grumbled against me, not one of you will enter the land. I swore with uplifted hand to make your home except Caleb son of Jephunneh and Joshua son of Nun. As for your children that you said would be taken as plunder, I will bring them in to enjoy the land you have rejected. But your bodies will fall in this desert. Your children will be shepherds here for 40 years, suffering for your unfaithfulness, until the last of your bodies lies in the desert for 40 years, 1 year for each of the 40 days you explored the land." That's how long the spies were in there. "You will suffer for your sins and know," this is the scary part, "what it is like to have me against you." Well, finally, they go through a bunch of trials, a bunch of time passes, and they're at the doorstep of the promised land again toward the end of Numbers. And now the people around there, the local kings and stuff, are starting to freak out. And there are some particular people groups who hire a local prophet named Balaam. This guy's a mystery. And we get this huge chunk of the end of Numbers is just about Balaam being hired with money to go and curse Israel. But he can't do it. An angel shows up, God shows up, and instead of cursing Israel, Balaam keeps giving these oracles that sounds a whole lot like the promises to Abraham and even Moses. And in the fourth of these 4 grand oracles of blessing that Balaam can't help but utter, even as he's trying to fulfill his contract and curse the people of Israel, God won't let him. And in the final of these oracles, he says this, I bet you've heard it before, "I see him, but not now. I behold him, but not near. A star will come out of Jacob, a scepter will rise out of Israel. He will crush the foreheads of Moab, the skulls of all the sons of Sheth." And it goes on like that for a while. Obviously, there's an immediate interpretation to this, but also there's obviously a long-term interpretation to this, as there is with the serpent that is raised up. Raised up like it's on a cross, it's lifted up. If you look at it, it heals your affliction. As there is with a sacrifice that happens in the middle of the book of Numbers, it's a substitution for the sins of the camp. There's a whole lot in here that seems to point right at Jesus. And indeed, the New Testament authors are often keen to look back at Numbers to make a lot of those same points. The book of Numbers ends with the people of Israel camped out at the doorstep looking in toward the promised land, primed to go in and do something they could have done many, many years earlier. Effectively, what happened here is they went out in the desert and they failed the test of trusting God. They were tempted by their hunger and their thirst and their anxiety, and it got the best of them. But even that points to another moment that we're going to run into in Matthew chapter 4, where somebody else goes out in the desert to face those tests that all humans face, and he passes them. And it turns out that the one guy who could pass the test of the temptation of sin is also the star who will come out of Jacob, predicted by Balaam. When you visualize the book of Numbers, picture the Israelites wandering around in the wilderness. When you think about the theme, reflect on how Israel failed the test in the desert, but God persists anyway. And if you don't have time to read the whole thing, make sure you catch Numbers 14:34 and then chapters 23 and 24, which will give you all those really interesting oracles of Balaam. And with that, my friends, we have leveled up our Book of Numbers game, which I'm very excited about. Next time around, we got the Book of Deuteronomy. All right. I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour Podcast. Let's do this again soon.
This podcast is supported by many of you at patreon.com/the TMBH podcast. We're grateful because it supports our family.